In the heart of Ikorodu, a quiet town, far from the bustling streets of Lagos, Moyin Ayodele had spent her entire life working the land. With her weathered hands, she had cultivated crops, raised children, and fought to build a life for her family. The Ayodele family's modest home was a reflection of the sacrifices Moyin had made over the years. It wasn't much, but it was theirs, filled with memories of love, laughter, and hard work. Moyin had raised her daughter, Adebimpe, as a single mother after her husband's passing. She had always taught Adebimpe the values of humility, hard work, and respect for the land. Adebimpe had always been the light of her life. Moyin had poured everything into raising her daughter, believing she would grow up to carry on their family legacy. But as time passed, Adebimpe's dreams became larger, her eyes searching beyond the horizon of Ikorodu. Adebimpe had always been a bright girl, full of potential and dreams. But as she grew older, she began to dream of a life far beyond their small town. Lagos, with its towering buildings and endless opportunities, had become a symbol of everything Adebimpe aspired to achieve. She had started hanging around a different circle of people who were wealthy, well-connected, and had the kind of lifestyle that Adebimpe thought she deserved. "Mama, I don't want this life anymore," Adebimpe had said one day as she sat across from her mother at the kitchen table. "There's so much more for me out there. In Lagos, I can make something of myself. I'll help us both. I'll make sure we don't have to struggle anymore." Moyin had watched her daughter with a mix of pride and concern. She knew that ambition could be a powerful thing, but she also knew the dangers of wanting too much too quickly. Lagos wasn't just a city. It was a world of power and corruption, a place where people often lost themselves in the chase for wealth. But Moyin, ever trusting of Adebimpe, agreed to support her dreams. She loved her daughter too much to say no. One evening, Adebimpe came to Moyin with a proposal. She had already talked to a businessman in Lagos, someone who could help them get started in the city. But in order to secure the deal, they would need the family's land. Adebimpe explained that selling the land would give them the financial freedom to move to Lagos, start fresh, and build a life without the burden of debt or struggling to survive. Moyin hesitated. The land was not just a piece of property. It was a symbol of everything she had worked for. It was her husband's legacy, the last piece of their life together. But Adebimpe's promises of a better future for both of them clouded Moyin's judgment. She could see how badly her daughter wanted this, how much she longed for a life of comfort. "I'll be fine, Mama. You've given me everything, and now it's my turn to take care of you," Adebimpe said, her voice soft and reassuring. Moyin signed the papers without realizing that this would be the last time she trusted her daughter so blindly. A few days later, Adebimpe packed up their things, preparing for their journey to Lagos. The train tickets were already booked, and Moyin, though hesitant, couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement. This was the new beginning that Adebimpe had promised. Moyin helped her daughter gather their bags, their belongings, everything they had left after selling the land. It wasn't much, just a few clothes and some personal items, but it was all they needed. As the train left the station, Moyin looked out the window at the familiar landscape of Ikorodu. Her heart felt heavy, but she pushed the feeling away. This was for the best, she told herself. They were moving on to a better life. She trusted her daughter. As the train sped towards Lagos, Moyin tried to make small talk with Adebimpe, but her daughter was absorbed in her phone, texting and making calls. The once close bond they shared was now distant. Moyin could feel the growing gap between them, but she didn't know how to bridge it. Adebimpe's mind was elsewhere, focused on the future she had planned. and it didn't include the simple, quiet life they had known. Moin sighed, but she didn't say anything. She had always trusted her daughter, and she had no reason to believe that would change now. But deep inside, she knew that something was shifting. The closer they got to Lagos, the more Adebimpe seemed to pull away. She was no longer the excited, grateful daughter who had once looked to her mother for everything. Now, Adebimpe was a woman with her own agenda, her own vision, and it didn't leave much room for Moin. "Mama, don't worry," Adebimpe said, her tone flat. "We'll be fine once we're in Lagos. I've already got everything planned. You'll see. This is going to be worth it." Moin nodded, but the discomfort in her chest only grew. This wasn't how she had imagined the move to Lagos. The bustling city, full of hope and opportunity, felt cold and distant to her. She had lost her connection to the life they had built, and she wasn't sure how to find it again. When they finally arrived in Lagos, Adebimpe whisked Moyin away to a high-rise apartment. The building was sleek and modern, a far cry from the humble home they had shared in Ikorodu. As they stepped inside, Moyin felt like a fish out of water. The apartment was luxurious, with a panoramic view of the city that left her breathless, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this was not the life she was meant for. As Adebimpe showed her around, Moyin tried to smile, but something felt wrong. The place was beautiful, yes, but it was empty of the warmth and love that had filled their old home. This wasn't what Moyin had worked for. She hadn't wanted a life of luxury. She wanted a life of love and togetherness. But Adebimpe was already planning her next steps, and Moyin was left behind. Over the next few days, Moyin felt more and more like an outsider. Adebimpe had become distant, focusing on her business plans and spending long hours on the phone with Jide, the businessman she had met in Lagos. She was constantly talking about investments, opportunities, and expansion, but never about the family. Moyin felt like a shadow in her own daughter's life. "Mama, please," Adebimpe said one evening, clearly annoyed. "Can't you see I'm busy? This is important. I'm trying to make our lives better. You have to trust me." Moyin nodded, but the hurt in her eyes was evident. She had trusted her daughter once, but now that trust was being slowly stripped away. Adebimpe was no longer the daughter she had known. She was someone else, someone driven by ambition, by greed, by the need to succeed, and Moyin couldn't keep up. It happened one night when Adebimpe was rushing around, preparing for another meeting. "Mama, I need you to sign these papers," she said, thrusting a pile of documents at her mother. Moyin glanced at the papers, but something about them felt wrong. "What are those, Adebimpe?" "It's nothing, Mama," Adebimpe snapped. "Just a formality. I need you to sign them so we can move forward." Moyin hesitated. "But what about the house? The land? You promised me that this would all work out, but it feels like you're leaving me behind." Adebimpe rolled her eyes. "Stop worrying, Mama. You signed the papers already. We're moving on, and you're just going to have to trust me." The argument continued to escalate, and Moyin felt the weight of betrayal building within her. She had given everything to this daughter, and now it seemed like her efforts were in vain. Her heart ached, but she didn't know how to express her pain. Finally, Adebimpe snapped, turning on her mother with cold eyes. "You're in the way." She grabbed her mother's arm and shoved her toward the open door of the apartment. "You've done enough, Mama." Before Moyin could react, Adebimpe gave her one final push, sending her mother stumbling out the door. Moyin fell, and the last thing she heard was Adebimpe's voice, fading away. The apartment door was wide open, and the blinding light from the hallway illuminated Adebimpe's cold, hard expression as she shoved Moyin towards the exit. Moyin's body jerked forward, her arms flailing as she tried to grasp at something, anything, that would steady her. But Adebimpe was too quick, too determined. In one swift motion, the older woman's body was thrust into the air, her feet leaving the ground. "Mama, you're holding me back," Adebimpe muttered under her breath, not even bothering to look back as Moin stumbled towards the door. Adebimpe watched as her mother lost her balance, her frail body swaying dangerously near the edge. Moin's hand brushed against the doorframe as she fell, her body slipping from her daughter's grasp, like sand between her fingers. The sound of Moin's scream was drowned by the rush of wind that came from the open window. Everything happened so fast. One moment, she was standing on the threshold of a new life, with her daughter, her only family, and the next, her body was hurled into nothingness, falling away from the safety of the apartment. Moin's fall happened in what felt like a moment, frozen in time, but in reality, it was instantaneous. As her body crashed to the ground below, her world spun. Her legs were tangled in the air, and she felt herself being pulled downward, unable to grab onto anything. The world was rushing by, a blur of metal and concrete, until everything stopped. Adebimpe stood still in the doorway, watching as her mother's body disappeared from view. For a moment, there was no sound, no movement. Everything fell silent. There was no scream, no cry for help. There was only the stillness, the empty space that stretched out before her. Adebimpe's eyes were wide, her expression unreadable, but underneath it all, a tiny flicker of regret, of realization, began to burn. Adebimpe stood at the doorway, staring blankly ahead. Her mind was racing, but there was nothing she could do now. Moin was gone, and her crime was irreversible. Adebimpe's chest tightened as a sense of panic slowly started to flood in, but it was quickly masked by the adrenaline coursing through her. She turned her back on the door and headed straight for her phone. The call to GD, the businessman she had been working with, was brief and hurried. "It's done," she said coldly. "She won't be in the way anymore. We can move forward." But even as she spoke, she knew something had shifted. The calm that had been a part of her for so long had disappeared. Her mind, once focused on ambition, now began to crack open, and the first seeds of regret began to grow. But they were buried beneath her need to succeed. Meanwhile, across the street, Mr. Chijioke, a man who had been sitting quietly in a cafe with a perfect view of the apartment building, had witnessed the entire event unfold. He had seen the way Adebimpe shoved her mother without remorse, and he had taken it upon himself to record the incident with his phone. He had been a stranger to the Iodel family, but something about their interaction had unsettled him. He had watched Adebimpe's coldness and knew that something wasn't right. Quickly, Mr. Chijioke sent the video to the authorities, making sure that what he had seen would not go unnoticed. The events that had unfolded on that train ride were being recorded for posterity, and it was time for justice to find its way through the darkness. He didn't know what the consequences would be, but he knew that Adebimpe needed to be held accountable. The sound of sirens echoed in the air as police arrived on the scene. Moin's body was discovered not long after the fall. The authorities began to investigate, and it didn't take long for them to connect the dots. The video evidence was clear. There was no denying what had happened. Adebimpe's actions were recorded in vivid detail, and the truth would soon come to light. But in her mind, Adebimpe was still in denial. She went about her day, arranging meetings and continuing with her business, acting as though everything was fine. She had pushed her mother out of her life, but she never expected the world to come crashing down so quickly. The guilt would come soon enough. But for now, she was still holding on to the idea that she had made the right choice. A few hours later, the police arrived at the apartment to question Adebimpe. The video had been shared widely, and the authorities were now investigating the crime. Adebimpe's mind raced as she was confronted with the reality of her actions. She tried to appear calm, but the truth was undeniable. The officers showed her the footage, and Adebimpe's heart sank. The image of her mother's final moments played in front of her eyes. There was no denying it. Adebimpe couldn't find the words to defend herself. She had been so sure of her plan, so confident that she could outsmart everyone. But now, everything was unraveling. Adebimpe's mind raced as the footage continued to play. She felt numb as she watched herself, her face twisted with impatience, pushing her mother out of the door. The silence that followed was deafening. The police officer's gaze was unwavering as he turned to her. "You did this, didn't you?" the officer asked. Adebimpe felt her world crumble. She tried to deny it, but the evidence was too clear. Her breath became shallow, her hands trembling as the realization of what she had done hit her. She had killed her own mother. Within moments, Adebimpe was arrested. The officers placed the cuffs on her, the cold metal biting into her skin. She had no choice but to go with them. As she was led out of the apartment, she could feel the eyes of onlookers on her. The shame, the guilt, it was all there, but it didn't matter anymore. She was going to pay the price for her actions. "Mama, I'm so sorry," she whispered to herself, though she knew it was too late to ask for forgiveness. The remorse that flooded through her was overwhelming, but it was the regret of a lifetime, a regret she would never be able to erase. As the authorities went through the building, Moyen's body was discovered near the tracks. She had fallen a great distance, a distance that had stolen her life from her. Her death was as tragic as it was senseless. The world Moyen had built with love and sacrifice had been destroyed by greed. The news of Moyen's death spread quickly. The community that had once embraced the Ayodele family now mourned her loss. The people of Ikorodu gathered to honor her memory, and the pain of losing someone so kind was felt deeply. Adebimpe's betrayal was more than a crime. It was a destruction of everything that had been good in their lives. In the quiet moments following her arrest, Adebimpe had nothing left. Her ambition had cost her everything. She was no longer the daughter of a beloved mother. She was just a criminal, a murderer. The weight of her actions crushed her, but she would never be able to bring her mother back. The days following her arrest were a blur for Adebimpe Ayodele. The grand plans she once had, the life of luxury in Lagos, the business empire she was building, now seemed like distant, fleeting dreams. Her cell felt suffocating, and no matter how hard she tried to close her eyes and block out the reality, she couldn't escape the images of her mother's final moments. Every night, as she lay on the hard prison cot, the coldness of the concrete floor seemed to mirror the numbness in her heart. Her actions had destroyed the very woman who had given her life, and Adebimpe was now forced to confront that fact every waking moment. The rush of adrenaline she had felt as she watched her mother fall. In her desperation to break free, she had convinced herself that she was doing it for both of them, that this was the only way to move forward. But now, all she had was emptiness. Her mother was gone, and she was trapped in a prison of her own making. A few days into her time in prison, Adebimpe received her first visitor. She had expected Jide, the businessman who had been part of her plans, to come to her aid, but instead, it was her estranged aunt, Mama Adebayo, who arrived at the prison gates. Mama Adebayo was an older woman, strict but full of wisdom. She had been a mother figure to Adebimpe after Moyen's husband passed away, offering guidance when needed, but always keeping a distance. When Adebimpe saw her aunt's stern face through the prison bars, something deep inside her shifted. "I never thought I would see this day, my child," Mama Adebayo said, her voice heavy with sorrow. "I never thought I would see you become the very thing I feared." Adebimpe's eyes filled with tears, but her aunt was unmoved. "You killed your mother, Adebimpe." The words were like daggers, and though they cut through Adebimpe's already fragile state, she knew they were the truth. "Mama, I didn't mean to," Adebimpe stammered, her voice breaking. But her aunt's eyes were hard and filled with disillusionment. "But you did, and now you will live with that for the rest of your life," she replied. After the visit, Adebimpe was left alone in her cell once again. Her aunt's words lingered in her mind, echoing through the cold walls of the prison. There was no escaping it. She had murdered her own mother, and no amount of wealth, no amount of success could ever take away the guilt. That night, as the darkness of the prison crept in, Adebimpe lay awake, thinking about her mother. Moyin had always been patient, kind, and loving. Her sacrifices were endless, her devotion unwavering. And now, Adebimpe had thrown it all away. The weight of her actions crashed down on her, and for the first time since the fall, Adebimpe allowed herself to truly feel the full extent of the loss. Her mother would never forgive her, and that thought burned through her like a relentless fire. Adebimpe was lost, drowning in her own selfishness, and the more she reflected on her actions, the more she realized that there would be no redemption for her. Months passed, and the trial of Adebimpe Ayodele began. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, family members, and onlookers who had been captivated by the tragedy of Moyin's death. The evidence was overwhelming. The video of Adebimpe's cold, calculated push, the witness accounts, the overwhelming grief of the community, and most importantly, the absence of Moyin Ayodele. Adebimpe sat in the defendant's chair, her face pale and drawn. The world she had known, of ambition, of success, of power, was now falling apart. She felt the weight of the prosecutor's gaze as the case was laid out, every detail of her crime exposed. When it was her turn to speak, Adebimpe's voice was hoarse. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I loved my mother, but I was so blinded by my own ambitions. I thought I was doing it for both of us, for a better life." Her words trailed off, but they were met with silence. The jury listened carefully, but the reality of her actions was clear. She had murdered her own mother, and no amount of remorse could change that. The courtroom was still as the judge rose to deliver the verdict. Adebimpe's heart raced, her palms sweaty as she prepared herself for whatever came next. The judge spoke clearly. "Adebimpe Ayodele, you are found guilty of manslaughter for the death of your mother, Moyin Ayodele. You will serve 10 years in prison." The sentence hit Adebimpe like a ton of bricks. She had expected punishment, but the reality of being imprisoned for the next decade was overwhelming. Her life had come to an end, but not in the way she had imagined. She had wanted freedom, and instead, she had bound herself to the one thing she never thought she'd face: a life without her mother. The courtroom remained silent as Adebimpe was escorted away, her hands shackled and her spirit broken. The life she had once wanted was gone, and all that remained was the cold, unyielding truth of her actions. Adebimpe had now spent more than a year in prison, but the passage of time didn't seem to make the guilt any easier to bear. The loneliness of the prison was suffocating, but it also provided her with the silence and space to think about her choices, her greed, and the irreversible damage she had caused. Each morning, the guards marched past her cell, and each day felt like a slow, unending reminder of the family she had destroyed. Her fellow inmates had long since stopped looking at her with disdain. Most had already formed their own views of her, and she knew that in their eyes, she was just another criminal, a murderer. But as the months wore on, the weight of her actions felt heavier. The thought of her mother, Moyin, the woman who had loved her unconditionally, was a constant companion in her thoughts. Adebimpe had begun to write more letters to her mother, letters she would never send. In each one, she poured out her regrets and asked for forgiveness. She didn't expect a reply. She didn't deserve one. But writing these letters gave her a small semblance of peace, an attempt to communicate with a ghost that would never answer. It was a quiet afternoon when Adebimpe had a rare moment of clarity. She had been sitting in the prison yard, alone, watching the other women go about their business. Some were chatting, some were working, and some, like her, seemed lost in their thoughts. Adebimpe was staring at the distant horizon, her mind a tangled mess of regret, when a thought struck her like a lightning bolt. Her mother's love had always been unconditional, and even though Adebimpe had betrayed that love, the truth was undeniable. Moyin had done everything for her. She had been the one person who had given her everything she needed: love, care, support, and Adebimpe had thrown it all away in the pursuit of selfish desires. This realization made Adebimpe's heart ache in a way that nothing had before. She had spent so long justifying her actions, telling herself that it was all for the better, that her ambitions justified the cruelty. But now she knew there was no excuse for what she had done. Adebimpe closed her eyes, allowing the tears to flow freely. The truth was simple. She had killed the one person who had ever truly cared for her. It had been almost 2 years since her arrest, when Adebimpe received another visit from her aunt, Mama Adebayo. The older woman was stern, as always, but there was a different softness to her demeanor now. She had never been one to coddle Adebimpe, but today, her eyes were filled with something more than disappointment. Adebimpe, Mama Adebayo said softly, sitting across from her at the visitation table. You've been in here for a long time now, and I know it hasn't been easy, but I want you to know that your mother would have forgiven you. Adebimpe looked up at her aunt, her heart clenching at the words. She didn't deserve forgiveness. She hadn't earned it. She was just a selfish, greedy woman who killed the one person who loved her. I don't think I can forgive myself, Adebimpe replied, her voice shaking. I took everything from her. How could she ever forgive me? Mama Adebayo sighed deeply. It's not about whether she would forgive you, Adebimpe. It's about what you do now. In her absence, you can still change. You can still make something of yourself. The words were like a lifeline, thrown to someone drowning. And for the first time in a long while, Adebimpe felt a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she could find redemption, not by erasing her past, but by facing it with honesty and humility. The visit with Mama Adebayo lingered in Adebimpe's mind for weeks. She began to see her time in prison in a different light. It wasn't just a punishment. It was an opportunity for change. She had spent so long avoiding the consequences of her actions. But now, it was time to confront them head on. Adebimpe began to read more. Books on personal development, self-reflection, and forgiveness. She attended prison counseling sessions, where she learned more about the importance of facing guilt and regret. The process was slow, but over time, Adebimpe started to understand that there was no quick fix to the damage she had done. Redemption would take time, and it would come through actions, not words. After a long, hard year, Adebimpe began to feel something shift within herself. The anger that had once consumed her was slowly replaced with a sense of responsibility. She no longer spent her days replaying her mother's death over and over. Instead, she began to focus on what she could do to make things right, She started working in the prison library, helping other inmates learn to read and write. She wanted to give back, to help others, like her, who had once made mistakes and needed someone to guide them toward a better life. It wasn't much, but it was a start. One day, after a particularly long shift in the library, Adebimpe sat down with a book in her hands, her heart beating a little lighter than before. She wasn't the same person she had been when she arrived in prison. She was different, humbled, repentant, and determined to make her mother proud, even though it was too late for that. Moyin, wherever you are, I promise to live better, to be better. After nearly 5 years in prison, Adebimpe was finally given the chance for a parole hearing. She had worked hard during her time behind bars, and the prison counselors and staff could see that she was a changed woman. The parole board was cautious, but they acknowledged the progress she had made. Sitting before the board, Adebimpe knew this moment could define the rest of her life. If they decided to release her, she would be given the opportunity to start again. But no matter what happened, she had already committed herself to changing. Whether in prison or out, she was going to spend the rest of her life trying to make amends for the harm she had caused. When the board asked her about her remorse for her crime, Adebimpe spoke from the heart. I've taken the life of the one person who loved me unconditionally. I can never undo that. But I'm trying to live a life that honors her memory. I don't expect forgiveness, but I hope, one day, to make peace with myself and with the world I've hurt. The parole board deliberated for hours. Finally, they returned with their decision. Adebimpe held her breath, her palms sweating. When they spoke, the words were heavy, but there was a glimmer of hope. We believe you have shown significant remorse, and we are granting you parole. However, we will be monitoring your progress closely. This is not the end of your journey. It is the beginning of a new one. Make the most of this opportunity. Adebimpe Iyodele. A wave of relief flooded over her. She had a second chance. A chance she had never thought she would get. But with this second chance came the responsibility of living with the consequences of her actions. Forever. The day Adebimpe walked out of prison was surreal. She had been in prison for nearly 5 years, but it felt like a lifetime. The weight of the prison doors closing behind her was not just a literal one. It was symbolic of the emotional chains she had spent so long shackled by. As she stepped into the bright daylight, Adebimpe felt like a stranger in the world she had once known. The city of Lagos looked different. It had changed, and so had she. She had no illusions about starting over. She didn't know what would come next, but she was determined to walk the road of redemption with her head held high. Returning to society was not easy. Adebimpe had lost everything: her business, her home, and her mother. There were still people who looked at her with disdain, still whispers behind her back, but she had learned to accept it. This was her penance, and she would carry it for as long as she lived. But Adebimpe didn't shrink from the struggle. She took odd jobs, helped with community programs, and volunteered at a local shelter. Slowly, she began to rebuild her life, one step at a time. Every night, she would sit quietly and think of Moyin, praying that somehow, somewhere, her mother could hear her and know that she was trying to do right by her legacy. The road to redemption would never be quick or easy, but Adebimpe was committed to it. The hurt she had caused was a stain she would never be able to erase, but she vowed to spend every day doing something meaningful, something that could help heal the wounds she had inflicted on herself and others. As she walked down the street, past the familiar sights of Lagos, Adebimpe thought of Moyin, and she whispered to the wind, "Mama, I'm sorry, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to make you proud." It had been 6 months since Adebimpe's release from prison, but the world outside was nothing like she remembered. The streets of Lagos were just as crowded, just as chaotic, but they felt different to her now. She was no longer a part of the fast-paced life she had once dreamed of, the life of privilege and success. Now, she was a woman with a criminal record, a woman who had taken her mother's life. Adebimpe had taken a job at a small local store, selling clothes, and though it wasn't much, it was enough to keep her afloat. She had little money and fewer friends, but it didn't matter. Every day, she woke up and went to work, taking responsibility for the choices she had made. There were days when Adebimpe would sit at the back of the store, staring out at the world, wondering if it was ever possible to feel like she belonged again. She was starting from scratch, and it wasn't easy. As Adebimpe worked, she would often remember her mother, Moyin's gentle voice, her soft laughter, her unwavering love. It was a love that Adebimpe had once taken for granted, but now she understood its depth. Moyin had sacrificed everything for her, but in the end, it wasn't enough to keep Adebimpe from making the worst mistake of her life. One evening, after a long day at work, Adebimpe sat alone in the small apartment she had rented. The walls felt empty, and the silence was deafening. She reached for a small photo of her mother that she had placed on the mantelpiece, the one with Moyin smiling in the garden. Adebimpe ran her fingers over the picture, feeling the sharp sting of guilt. "I'm sorry, Mama," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'll never forgive myself, but I'm going to keep trying." Adebimpe could no longer hide from the consequences of her actions, and every tear she shed was a step toward coming to terms with her guilt. But with each tear, she also found a small piece of healing, a tiny flicker of hope that perhaps, one day, she could make peace with the past. Adebimpe knew that she couldn't undo the damage she had caused, but she could try to make a difference in the world around her. It started small, helping at a local shelter, volunteering to teach literacy classes to women who were struggling to read and write. As she stood in front of a class of women, her heart began to heal. She spoke to them about her own mistakes, her own journey through life, and how education had been her only way forward. It wasn't much, but the women responded with appreciation, seeing Adebimpe not as a criminal, but as someone who had learned from her mistakes. One day, as she was finishing her class, a woman approached her. She was older, with kind eyes and a gentle smile. "You're doing good work, Adebimpe. You're helping people." Adebimpe's heart swelled. "I'm just trying to do something right," she said, her voice full of sincerity. "It's the least I can do after everything I've done." It had been over a year since Adebimpe had spoken to Yidi, the businessman she had once thought would be her ticket to success. He had helped her sell the family's property and promised her a future full of opportunity. But now, Adebimpe was a different woman. She no longer sought power, wealth, or success. One evening, Jide reached out to her. He wanted to meet. Adebimpe was hesitant at first. The last time they had spoken, it was to discuss business. But now, their worlds were vastly different. She agreed to meet at a local cafe, and as she walked in, she saw Jide sitting at a table, his face serious but not unkind. They exchanged pleasantries, but it was clear that neither of them knew how to proceed. "Adebimpe," Jide began, breaking the silence. "I know things didn't go as planned, but I wanted to check in on you. I heard about your time in prison." Adebimpe nodded, her eyes lowering. "I don't expect any sympathy, Jide, but I'm trying to make amends. I know I can't undo what I did, but I can at least try to live differently now." Jide looked at her, his eyes softening. I've heard about the work you've been doing with the women's shelter. That's good. You're doing good work, Adebimpe. Adebimpe smiled faintly. I'm trying. She paused, then looked him in the eye. But I don't want to go back to the life we talked about. I don't need your help with business or power. I just want to be at peace with myself. Jide nodded, understanding. I respect that. Maybe for the first time you're finding what you truly need. That night, as Adebimpe walked home, she felt something that she hadn't felt in a long time. A sense of freedom. She had faced her past, and though it wasn't easy, she was learning to live with it. The weight of her actions would never leave her, but the guilt no longer consumed her. Adebimpe had no illusions about her future. She knew she would never be able to replace what she had taken from her mother. But she also knew that she could spend the rest of her life making things right, one step at a time. That evening, as she entered her small apartment, Adebimpe took out her notebook, the one where she had written her letters to Moyin. She opened it to a new page and began to write. Mama, I hope you can hear me. I'm sorry, and I'm doing my best to live a better life. As she wrote, Adebimpe felt a strange peace wash over her, a peace that had eluded her for so long. For the first time in years, she felt like she was finally walking the path of redemption. As time passed, Adebimpe's commitment to redemption began to shape the course of her life. She had continued working at the local store, but she had also expanded her efforts to help those who were struggling, especially women like her mother, who had always worked tirelessly to provide for her family. One day, a local community center reached out to Adebimpe, asking if she could help lead a new initiative to teach financial literacy to women. Adebimpe saw this as her chance to make a real difference. She was not a businesswoman anymore, but she had learned from her mistakes. She could teach women how to build a life on their own, free from the mistakes she had made. The program was well received, but as Adebimpe's first class began, she realized that teaching wasn't as easy as she had thought. The women in the class were wary of her. They didn't trust her at first. Knowing her past, they saw her as a criminal, a woman who had lost everything. Adebimpe didn't shy away from their suspicion. Instead, she faced it head on. I know you don't trust me, she said to them one day. I don't deserve your trust, but I'm here to show you that you can build a future, even from the hardest of places. I've been where you are, and I've learned to pick myself up. Over time, the women began to open up to her. They saw her sincerity, and they began to respect her. Adebimpe was no longer a woman bound by her past. She was a woman who had rebuilt herself, a woman who had learned from her mistakes. At the end of the first course, one of the women approached her, her face full of gratitude. Thank you, Adebimpe, she said. You've changed my life. For the first time in a long while, Adebimpe felt proud. This was success, not the money or power she had once sought, but the ability to help others, to give them the tools they needed to build a better future. Months later, Adebimpe received a phone call from her aunt, Mama Adebayo. She had heard about Adebimpe's work in the community and wanted to visit. When they sat down together, Mama Adebayo said something that struck Adebimpe deeply. You have done more for others than you ever did for yourself, Adebimpe. Your redemption is not about forgiving yourself. It's about using your pain to help others. As Adebimpe continued her work in the community, she came to realize that the true path to redemption wasn't in waiting for forgiveness. It was in making a difference with the time she had left. Her mother's legacy lived on through the lives she touched, and in her heart, Adebimpe finally found peace. She would never erase the past, but she could honor it by making the future better. And in doing so, she would keep her mother's memory alive forever. It had been 5 years since Adebimpe had been released from prison, and she was no longer the woman who had been consumed by ambition and greed. The journey from that moment of her mother's fall to this day had been long and grueling, full of self-doubt, guilt, and a burning desire to make things right. Adebimpe had come to terms with the fact that she could never undo the harm she had caused. Her mother, Moyin, was gone forever, and nothing in the world could bring her back. But in the quiet moments of reflection, Adebimpe realized that her mother's love still guided her. Even though she had failed to honor her mother in life, she could still honor her memory through her actions. Moyin had always believed in the value of hard work and compassion, and Adebimpe had spent the past few years trying to embody those values. The shame of what she had done would always follow her, but she had found a way to live with it, not by running from it, but by accepting it and learning from it. One bright Saturday morning, as Adebimpe sat by the window, watching the city of Lagos bustle around her, she received a letter from Mama Adebayo. The letter was short, but it was filled with words that Adebimpe never expected to hear. Adebimpe, I have watched you change over the years. I have seen your efforts to rebuild yourself and make amends. And though you may not believe it, you are forgiven. I hope that, in time, you can forgive yourself as well. Moyin would have been proud of you. The words hit Adebimpe like a floodgate opening, and for the first time in years, she felt a warmth in her heart, something that had been buried for so long: forgiveness. It wasn't just from Mama Adebayo. It was a gift from herself. She had been carrying the burden of unforgiveness for too long, and now, in that moment, it felt like she could finally set it down. Over the years, Adebimpe had become a mentor to many. Her work in the community had expanded, and she was now leading multiple initiatives to help women in need. She had started several programs, including financial literacy courses, career development workshops, and support groups for mothers who had gone through similar struggles as she had. She used her past experiences to teach others about resilience, about the importance of not giving up, even when everything seemed lost. One afternoon, after a class on empowerment and personal growth, one of the women who had been in the program approached Adebimpe. "Adebimpe, I just wanted to thank you," the woman said. "You've changed my life. I was so lost before I came here, but you've shown me that I can make something of myself. You've given me hope." The words filled Adebimpe with a quiet pride, and she realized that her journey of redemption was not just about herself anymore. It was about helping others rise above their own pain, and in doing so, honoring the legacy of Moyin's selflessness and love. One afternoon, Adebimpe stood in the garden outside her small apartment, tending to the plants that had been gifted to her by Mama Adebayo. As she worked, she thought of the countless days she had spent with her mother, working the land in Ikorodu, planting crops, and nurturing the earth. Those moments, though simple, were some of the happiest memories of her life. Now, in her own small garden, Adebimpe felt connected to her mother again. She imagined Moyin watching over her, smiling as she tended to the plants, just as they had done together. "I'm doing the best I can, Mama," Adebimpe whispered, as the wind rustled the leaves around her. "I hope you're proud of me." There was no reply, of course, but for the first time in years, Adebimpe felt at peace with herself. She had done the work, she had put in the effort, and she had learned the most valuable lesson of all: that redemption wasn't about forgetting the past. It was about learning from it, growing from it, and using it to do something meaningful in the world. A few years later, Adebimpe returned to Ikorodu, where her mother had once lived. The town had changed, but the memories of her childhood were still vivid. She visited Moyne's grave, standing before it with a sense of reverence and quiet reflection. The weight of her loss would never truly disappear, but Adebimpe had made peace with it. She knelt down beside the grave, a single tear slipping down her cheek. "I'm sorry, Mama, for everything, but I'm finally free, and I'm going to live the rest of my life honoring you. This is for you." As the sun set over the town, Adebimpe felt a sense of closure. The years of pain, of self-doubt, and of regret had been heavy, but she had finally found her way through the darkness. Her mother's love had never wavered, and now Adebimpe could feel her in every step she took, in every life she touched. Moyne's spirit lived on in her daughter, and that was the truest form of redemption.